International business cycles display a high degree of synchronization. For instance, virtually all advanced economies, and many developing countries as well, suffer large and simultaneous declines in output during the 2008-2009 recession. The sources of such spillovers are of obvious concern to policymakers, but while a great deal of empirical work has documented the financial and policy channels of such spillovers, a lot less is known about the effects from real, non-financial channels, such as international trade and investment. Disentangling a causal channel that arises from linkages created by trade and multinational production is really difficult, as economists generally do not have access to controlled experiments, which they can use to study particular macroeconomic mechanisms. In this paper, we provide new evidence for the role of trade and multinational firms in cross-country transmission of shocks. Two novel contributions enable us to identify the specific mechanism at work. First, we link information on international ownership to firm-level data from the US Census Bureau and develop a new methodology for identifying intermediate input trade at the firm level. Second, we use a large and exogenous shock as a natural experiment, the 2011 Japanese Tohoku Earthquake and Tsunami, which we can use to isolate causal spillovers from potentially confounding other factors. The 2011 Tohoku event was in fact a triple disaster beginning on March 11, 2011 with an earthquake that measured 9.0 MW, the fourth largest earthquake event ever recorded. Perhaps more damaging than the earthquake itself was the subsequent tsunami, which inundated entire towns and coastal fishing villages across northeast Japan. Finally, the partial meltdown of the nuclear reactor near Fukushima had a devastating effect on the region, and the precautionary shutdown of all nuclear power plants in the country resulted in severe power outages that persisted for months. In addition to the human tragedy caused by the cumulative effect of these disasters, there were several consequences for Japanese industrial production. Manufacturing output fell by roughly 15 percentage points in the month of March, only recovering to pre-shock levels 5 months later in August. As expected, US imports from Japan fell dramatically as well, though the large drop that was recorded in April 2011 reflected the several weeks of travel time for goods to reach the United States. More surprising, perhaps, is the effect of this shock on the US economy. US manufacturing output fell by about 1% below trend in the month of April and remained significantly below prior levels for roughly 6 months following the Tohoku event. What were the mechanisms behind the transmission of this shock to the US economy? To answer this question, we turn to the detailed firm-level data at our disposal. In particular, we focus on the role of vertical production linkages as a conduit for the transmission of this shock to the United States. The scope for shocks to the supply of imported inputs to affect US output depends critically on how easily the firm can substitute towards other inputs or find new suppliers. For example, a temporary disruption in oil production affecting a single small country is unlikely to seriously impact US firms, since oil is a global commodity with many alternate sources of supply. Specialized firm-specific inputs may have fewer alternative sources, and hence disruptions to the supply of these inputs may exhibit greater spillover effects. With this in mind, we focus on US manufacturing firms' exposure to Japanese inputs. The US manufacturing affiliates of Japanese multinationals are almost universally highly dependent on inputs from Japan. These inputs comprise almost 1/4 of the cost share of these firms' US production, and the large majority, over 86%, is purchased intra-firm. Moreover, these firms are very large. Taken as a whole, they represent over 60% of the total US imports of intermediate inputs from Japan. We find that the US manufacturing affiliates of Japanese multinationals suffered large drops in US output in the months following the shock, roughly 1-for-1 with the fall in imported inputs. Such behavior indicates that there's virtually no scope for substitution to other inputs for these firms, such that the shock passed directly to their US operations following the shock in Japan. Estimates for this substitutability are much lower than those typically used by economists to evaluate the cross-country transmission of shocks via international trade. We complement our analysis with the estimation of a structural model of production function and find that the elasticity of substitution between Japanese and non-Japanese material inputs for the Japanese multinationals in the US is only 0.2, confirming there is almost no substitutability between them. Our results also suggest that these firms reduce their expenditures on non-Japanese inputs in line with the fall in Japanese inputs. This implies that other firms in the US economy upstream or downstream from Japanese affiliates, would have suffered from the shock even without direct input exposure to Japan. Such network effects, which have been the topic of other research, could propagate the shock throughout an economy and can serve to both amplify and extend its impact. Our findings suggest that global supply chains are sufficiently rigid to play an important role in the cross-country transmission of shocks. We believe that there are three key lessons for policymakers resulting from this research. First, the responsiveness of trade patterns to exchange rate changes may be muted in the short run. Second, trade linkages and increased international input sourcing, which follows from increased foreign direct investment by multinational firms, will not always lead to greater diversification of country-specific supply chain risk. And finally, in light of the very low input substitutability that we find, policies that are proposed that would affect the production decisions of firms, particularly when they're multinationals, should include sufficient notice in order to prevent short-run disruptions. I conclude with a disclaimer. We have used confidential census data in this project, and therefore any opinions and conclusions expressed herein are those of the authors of this paper and do not necessarily represent the views of the U.S. Census Bureau. All results have been reviewed to ensure that no confidential information is disclosed.